one of the most intuitive ways to think about like how much protein should a dog eat is how much protein, if you gave a dog a real authentic choice, if you gave it the all you can eat buffet of different kinds of nutrients, and you just said, eat whatever you want, how much of their diet would be protein if you were to do that? If you could somehow set up an environment where your dog had access to fat, carbohydrate, protein, in all kinds of different quantities, and then you watched it over time, how much protein would it eat? And the reality is that scientists have done that. They've done that experiment. They've done it multiple times where they basically create a kind of food setup that has variability baked into it. And then they watch over time how much of each of the different like little buckets of food the dogs take in, and they can draw out averages based on that.
And if I remember correctly, that's like free feeding or self-feeding?
Yeah, that's typically the way that it's done, is they just like, they let the dog choose for themselves, self-selection, free feeding studies, and they set up enough different kinds of food and different amounts of nutrition in each one that you can derive some patterns based on when you watch like what the dogs eat. And when that has been done, what is typically seen is just under 50% of the calories that the dogs want to eat is protein. That if you give dogs the chance to choose for themselves, they're going to take in about 44% of their calories from protein. Point number one.
Okay.
Point number two. Like we mentioned before, dogs and wolves, very similar animals. 98% genetic overlap. So their mitochondrial DNA is exactly the same for 98%. They're so similar that they can breed with one another, which is like a lot of biologists, if you just ask them, how do I like, what's the difference between one species and another? The way they define it is they say, well, two different species can't breed with one another. You know, like a blue whale and a polar bear can't breed and make an actual offspring. They're different species. It doesn't work like that. Dogs and wolves are two different species, but they're so similar that they can interbreed with one another. And I don't know if they're the only two species in the world where that's the case. I'm sure there are like weird microbials that can do stuff like that. But generally speaking, it's incredibly rare. And so that it gives you a sense of how similar they are. And the last thing that shows how similar they are is that like they had, if you look back in their history, genetically, their evolution as canine species has taken more than 100 million years. 100 million, you know, it's like whatever, 10 million generations. And for all 99.99% of that, they were exactly the same species. They split off just in the past 10,000 years. Okay. So for the vast majority of the time, they were doing they were one and the same. All of which means it's really relevant to understand wolves in the wild. People aren't making decisions about what to feed them, right? They're out there eating whatever is most natural for them to eat, given their lifestyle, given their environment, given their biology. And plenty of scientists have looked at basically what do wolves tend to eat, and they've thought about it in terms of like nutrient percentages, just like we get when we look at self-selection studies in dogs. And when that is done, the most common answer, the way that the kind of the black letter like dogma of the science, if you're just like reading a textbook, is that just over 50% of the calories that wolves take in tend to come from protein. Number that you see most commonly is 52%. 52% of calories. So really similar to what, if you left to their own devices, wolves will take in to what dogs will take in. Just right around that half their total number of calories point is what they tend to take in. And like we said before, it makes all the sense in the world about wolves, right? Because we know like wolves are carnivores. They eat, in my book, I lived with the folks from the Yellowstone Wolf Project for a period of time, and you hear them talk about the ecology of wolves, the diet of wolves, and it is, with almost no exception, all meat. They take down big game in Yellowstone, at least. They take down these things, ungulates, things like elk. And that stuff is obviously made up of protein and fat to a less significant degree. So just over half the calories that wolves tend to eat come from protein as well. So first two ways to think about the amount of protein that a dog should eat is, one, if you leave them to their own devices, they're going to take in just under half of their calories from protein. Number two is, if you look in their genetic history, what's most natural given the course of their development? For tens of millions of years, they've taken in the diet of the same diet that a wolf eats, which is just about, again, half of the calories from protein.
Right.
Third way to think about what's optimal amount of protein for your dog is the number that the regulatory body in the United States says that the percentage of a product's calories, pet food products calories, that the regulators say has to be protein if you want to sell it in the United States. So like I said before, there are bodies that regulate the sale of pet food in the US. You can't just come out there and start selling something made up of whatever nutritional content you want and tell consumers this is the best stuff ever. You've got to demonstrate in some ways that it contains a certain nutritional content, because science knows that if you don't give a dog that something that meets that nutritional profile, that it's going to get a deficiency disease. And so and that's very much the case with protein. Enough science has been done to understand that if your dog takes in less than 16% of its calories from protein, it's at the risk of developing deficiency diseases. And in the case of protein, unlike vitamin C leading to the development of scurvy, in protein, you're talking about like literal starvation. You're talking about malnutrition, where it doesn't get enough protein to do the three things that we talked about at the beginning. And what that means is, like, basically you're talking about breakdown of vital tissues. You have these tissues that are cycling out of the proteins of which they're made up all the time, 24 hours a day in your dog's body. And if you don't give it at least 16% protein in its diet, you're not going to be replenishing that stuff. And you're going to experience that. Your dog will see that as muscle wasting. Like, you'll see over time, if you don't give your dog 16% protein, it will lose muscle mass. That's a well-demonstrated thing.
I so wish that everyone knew that number, by the way. Like, just know it.
Yeah. Except for the fact that it's, in this case, we're trying to compare apples to apples here, right? And so we're talking about percentage of percentage of calories. So 16% is the percentage of calories that the regulators say, if you don't give your dog that much, the science says it's going to start to develop a deficiency disease. And so what that means is that's also the line that they say a pet food has to contain that much. Basically, you got to clear that 16% of calories threshold if you want to sell pet food in the United States. Now, the difficulty, though, is that it doesn't mean just flip over the bag and look for the number 16 or more next to the protein. Like, if you're buying it in the store, you can rest assured it contains at least 16% of calories from protein, because it's illegal to do it otherwise. But the issue is, if you're trying to find out exactly how much protein is in there and you just look at the percentage, that's going to be a reflection, like we said before, of the as fed by weight percentage. And so it's not like you're like looking for 16 or 44 or 52 there. But basically, again, this is just like a rubric concept thing. Like, all we're talking about now is like concept, like what the science shows. Science shows that if you feed a dog less than 16% of its calories from protein, it's going to develop deficiency disease. Studies show that wolves typically take in 52% of their calories from protein. And studies show that dogs, if left to their own devices, will take in 44% of their calories from protein. And in case you need to take that home, I think we have another slide, right? That's like, that compares all three of those and shows, because it gives you a sense of like, it's a big difference, right? That gap between what is needed in order to avoid deficiency disease and what is common if left to their own devices is big. You can see it represented here. Like, this is a big difference.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
It almost looks like 3 times.
Yeah, exactly. It's about 3 times.
Them.
That's right. And yeah, you can see we drew on the line there. Like, if you to demonstrate the difference between these 3 different like ways of thinking about percentage, Ketona, our chicken recipe, if you look at the back of the bag, its guaranteed protein content is 46% as fed, which works out to 42%, excuse me, of the calories in the products. You can see it's like it has to go through that conversion process. So there are kind of implications here, right? It's like, these are 3 things that we know for sure that the science like demonstrates to good effect. And so when thinking about, okay, well, which one of these do I want to strive for my dog? You've got to think about what to you're aiming to accomplish. Yeah, I mean, in any of these cases, you can feel good. You're not going to starve your dog as long as you're giving it more than 16% of its calories from protein. But the issue is, do you actually want to feed it more to help ensure other health outcomes, stuff that's not just about acute deficiency where it's immediately going to begin going into some kind of degradation process, but like over long term, do these things tend to decrease chronic disease risk and make my dog, like improve my dog's what they call health span, like the period of time, the amount of time in its life where it's doing healthy things. And so for me, by far the more compelling, rather than just trying to feed my dog something where I just barely clear the hurdle of the amount that's needed to keep it out of starvation, I think you're being much more sensible trying to feed it a percentage that is A, consistent with its evolutionary heritage, and B, consistent with its natural instincts, which are both to consume about half of its calories from protein. However, when I tell people that, sometimes people will say, well, wait a second. I'm worried about giving my dog too much protein.
Right. That's what I was going to jump in and say is that, well, where do we stand of, you do see not just high protein on labels, but there is kind of something floating out there in the industry. And I have heard it of, I don't want to give my dog too much protein.
Yep. Yeah. So basically, and this is worth noting for everybody that's listening here, or I guess watching on video, in the show notes, you'll be able to find links to the studies that demonstrate the 3 points that we've already gone into about like what the different percentages are for different kinds of experiments.